Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, it's an honor to share this platform with the chairman and Dr. Ree and Dr. Ali, and to bring you greetings from Cornell University. We appreciate your participation and look forward to working with you not only today and tomorrow, but certainly in the future. This conference places us on the frontier of three major movements that are reaching into all corners of the world. And when I say all corners of the world, I am not exaggerating, and I'll come back to that phrase, all corners of the world, in just a few moments. One of the three movements that I'm referring to is the increasing use of information and communication technologies for development that we've been talking about. I remember 30 years ago participating in annual UN roundtable discussions about communication and development. And it was the subject of our meetings, how to get governments and international development agencies to include communication as a component of their development strategies. It was not easy. Erskine Childers was a name that came up frequently, and of course he was one of our roundtable members. And he tried very hard, with some success, to get something called development support communication into the dialogue. He convinced not only people in the UN system, but those of us in academia to begin to talk about development support communication. And then, almost suddenly, at the turn of the century, the flood of new information technologies awakened the international community to the potential of ICTs for development. You may remember the G8 nations at the turn of the century asserted that information and communication technologies can be one of the most potent forces in the 21st century. That's a fairly dramatic statement coming from the G8 nations. And then, of course, as Dr. Ree has mentioned, we had the conferences in Tunis, the World Information Society, the conferences on the information and communication technology in the world. And more recently, we have the World Bank instituting a new program called Information and Communication Technology Strategy that's aimed at helping developing nations use ICT effectively. Earlier, you'll remember I used the term reaching into all corners of the earth. Well, let me explain. Google's project called Project Loon, the loon comes from the word balloon. Project Loon intends to use balloons to deliver internet access to the 60% of the world's population who currently do not have access to the internet, and they don't have access to needed services such as health and education, enterprises, and other priorities such as those specified in the Millennium Development Goals. Thus, Project Loon uses balloons to deliver internet access to the world's most remote areas. These balloons are a special technology that floats up into the stratosphere twice as high as airplanes fly. These Loon balloons get around with the aid of the wind, which is very prominent in those stratospheric areas. Google says that the balloons, which can float about 100 days, are an environmentally friendly way of getting internet access out to people because they use solar panels, which produce up to 100 watts of power in full sun. And so we will reach all corners of the world with ICTs and with balloons. Well, that was the first movement that I wanted to talk about. Let me talk about the second movement. As we've seen, a second movement has been putting the potential of new communication technology into the higher education curriculum. And Dr. Ri and her colleagues in Korea at the APC-ICT have given strong energy to this movement. They have moved toward training future leaders in the region so the ICTs can be used successfully in dealing with governance, with climate change, with disasters, and other aspects of development. So this is a very important second movement. Meanwhile, there's another movement taking place. Let's call it the Reinventing Universities movement. While some universities, many of them in the United States, have had public service as part of their founding mandates, higher education conferences from Bangkok to Vancouver for the past decade have begun to call to universities to become more actively engaged in civic activities, engaged in communities both locally and globally. And a major part of this process is moving students beyond the classroom and into the communities where they can apply their knowledge, they can learn themselves from communities, and bring benefits to those communities. That's the civic engagement. And as we will see in these 2 days, engaged learning or service learning was a response that helped change the academic culture of many universities. And finally, the fourth movement. Now at this conference, we face the possibility, perhaps the challenge, of blending these movements into a new step. Can we combine ICT for development with university ICTD curriculum along with service learning? Can we combine these elements? Yes, I'll answer that. We can. And we have seen it here in Asia. We've seen it done at Hong Kong Polytech University. We have one of our fine participants here from Hong Kong Polytech University, and we'll hear more of this later. But in a service learning project called Technology Without Boundary, Polytech University students went out of their classrooms and taught local primary school children and orphans in Cambodia and Rwanda how to use software to do digital storytelling, to do animation programs, and even to making robotic cars. The Polytech students also set up computer labs and an intranet system in an NGO and provided training for its staff to make use of social media. So we've seen that it can be done. The challenge to us here at this conference is to build resources that will help students at other universities in Asia and perhaps around the world to become major players in these movements. And thus, our task at this conference is to have a workshop, and I use the workshop to suggest that we're not just going to be listening, but we're going to be working and working together, where we give energy to this fourth movement. We welcome all of you to the conference and to the challenge. And by working together, we can help build the resources that will move us toward engaged learning and the ICTD curriculum. Thank you.